Welcome to Games and Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week we're trying something new, a very long episode based on the Pentamerone. So strap in for a long one, listeners. We hit some juicy folklore in these three stories, and if we can't find a use for a dragon cruising the streets of a town in a car powered by 4 golden elephants, then are we even trying? What are we doing here? The Unboldrise story is very similar to the one that follows. There is the scatological humour we have come to expect from the Pentamerone. The farmer's wife calls her husband a hernia, for example. When the palace is turned to gold, it is, quote, like a gilded pill that makes 100 houses constipated by ill fortune evacuate their poverty. This, presumably, is a reference to perpetual antimony pills, which I thought were a later invention, but turns out they're medieval. In the section where the maiden asks the prince to forget his love, he says he cannot, even if the love gives him a dose of senna to purge it with. Senna is a herb that's still used in over-the-counter laxatives. I once again make reference to Dav Pilkey and Captain Underpants. And now to our first story, The Serpent.
Stories from Pentamerone by Giambattista Basile. Chapter 14. The Serpent. Recording by Joy Chan. It always happens that he who is over-curious in prying into the affairs of other people strikes his own foot with the axe, and the King of Longfurrow is a proof of this, who, by poking his nose into secrets, brought his daughter into trouble and ruined his unhappy son-in-law, who, in attempting to make a thrust with his head, was left with it broken. There was once on a time a gardener's wife who longed to have a son more than a man in a fever for cold water, or the innkeeper for the arrival of the mail-coach. It chanced one day that the poor man went to the mountain to get a faggot, and when he came home and opened it, he found a pretty little serpent among the twigs. At the sight of this, Sapatella, for that was the name of the gardener's wife, heaved a deep sigh, and said, "Alas! Even the serpents have their little serpents, but I brought ill luck with me into this world." At these words the little serpent spoke and said, "Well then, since you cannot have children, take me for a child, and you will make a good bargain, for I shall love you better than my mother." Sapatella, hearing a serpent speak thus, nearly fainted, but, plucking up courage, she said, "If it were for nothing else than the affection which you offer, I am content to take you, and treat you as if you were really my own child." So saying, she assigned him a hole in a corner of the house for a cradle, and gave him for food a share of what she had with the greatest good-will in the world. The serpent increased in size from day to day, and when he had grown pretty big, he said to Cola Matteo, the gardener, whom he looked on as his father, "Daddy, I want to get married." "With all my heart," said Cola Matteo. "We must look out for another serpent like yourself, and try to make up a match between you." "What serpent are you talking of?" said the little serpent. "I suppose, forsooth, we are all the same with vipers and adders. It is easy to see you are nothing but a country bumpkin, and make a nosegay of every plant. I want the king's daughter. So go this very instant and ask the king for her, and tell him it is a serpent who demands her." Cola Matteo, who was a plain, straightforward kind of man, and knew nothing about matters of this sort, went innocently to the king and delivered his message, saying, "The messenger should not be beaten more than are the sands upon the shore. Know then that a serpent wants your daughter for his wife, and I am come to try if we can make a match between a serpent and a dove." The king, who saw at a glance that he was a blockhead, to get rid of him, said, "Go and tell the serpent that I will give him my daughter if he turns all the fruit of this orchard into gold." And so saying, he burst out a-laughing and dismissed him. When Cola Matteo went home and delivered the answer to the serpent, he said, "Go tomorrow morning and gather up all the fruit stones you can find in the city, and sow them in the orchard, and you will see pearls strung on rushes." Cola Matteo, who was no conjurer, neither knew how to comply nor refuse. So next morning, as soon as the sun with his golden broom had swept away the dirt of the night from the fields watered by the dawn, he took a basket on his arm and went from street to street, picking up all the stones of peaches, plums, nectarines, apricots, and cherries that he could find. He then went to the orchard of the palace and sowed them as the serpent had desired. In an instant the trees shot up, and stems and branches, leaves, flowers, and fruit were all of glittering gold, at the sight of which the king was in an ecstasy of amazement, and cried aloud with joy. But when Cola Matteo was sent by the serpent to the king to demand the performance of his promise, the king said, "Fair and easy, I must first have something else if he would have my daughter, and it is that he make all the walls and the ground of the orchard to be of precious stones." When the gardener told this to the serpent, he made answer, "Go tomorrow morning and gather up all the bits of broken crockeryware you can find, and throw them on the walks and on the walls of the orchard, for we will not let this small difficulty stand in our way." As soon, therefore, as the night, having aided the robbers, is banished from the sky, and goes about collecting the faggots of twilight, Cola Matteo took a basket under his arm and went about collecting bits of tiles, lids, and bottoms of pipkins, pieces of plate and dishes, handles of jugs, spouts of pitchers. He picked up all the spoiled, broken, cracked lamps, and all the fragments of pottery he could find in his way. And when he had done all that the serpent had told him, you could see the whole orchard mantled with emeralds and chalcedonies, and coated with rubies and carbuncles, so that the lustre dazzled your eyes. The king was struck all of a heap by the sight, and knew not what had befallen him. But when the serpent sent again to let him know that he was expecting the performance of his promise, the king answered, "Oh, all that has been done is nothing, if he does not turn this palace into gold." When Cola Matteo told the serpent this new fancy of the king's, the serpent said, "Go and get a bundle of herbs, and rub the bottom of the palace walls with them. We shall see if we cannot satisfy this whim." Away went Cola that very moment, and made a great broom of cabbages, radishes, leeks, parsley, turnips, and carrots. And when he had rubbed the lower part of the palace with it, instantly you might see it shining like a golden ball on a weather vane. And when the gardener came again to demand the hand of the princess, the king, seeing all his retreat cut off, called his daughter and said to her, "My dear Granonia, I have tried to get rid of a suitor who asked to marry you, by making such conditions as seemed to me impossible. But as I am beaten and obliged to consent, I pray you, as you are a dutiful daughter, to enable me to keep my word, and to be content with what fate wills and I am obliged to do." "Do as you please, father," said Granonia. "I shall not oppose a single jot of your will." The king, hearing this, bade Cola Matteo tell the serpent to come. The serpent then set out for the palace, mounted on a car all of gold and drawn by 4 golden elephants. But wherever he came the people fled away in terror, seeing such a large and frightful serpent making his progress through the city. And when he arrived at the palace, the courtiers all trembled like rushes and ran away, and even the very scullions did not dare to stay in the palace. The king and queen, also shivering with fear, crept into a chamber. Only Granonia stood her ground, for though her father and her mother cried continually, "Fly, fly, Granonia, save yourself!" she would not stir from the spot, saying, "Why should I fly from the husband you have given me?" And when the serpent came into the room, he took Granonia by the waist in his tail, and gave her such a shower of kisses that the king writhed like a worm, and went as pale as death. Then the serpent carried her into another room and fastened the door, and shaking off his skin on the floor, he became a most beautiful youth, with a head all covered with ringlets of gold, and with eyes that would enchant you. When the king saw the serpent go into the room with his daughter and shut the door after him, he said to his wife, "Heaven have mercy on that good soul, my daughter, for she is dead to a certainty, and that accursed serpent has doubtless swallowed her down like the yolk of an egg." Then he put his eye to the keyhole to see what had become of her. But when he saw the exceeding beauty of the youth, and the skin of the serpent that he had left lying on the ground, he gave the door a kick. Then in they rushed, and, taking the skin, flung it into the fire and burned it. When the youth saw this, he cried, "Ah, fools, what have you done?" And instantly he was turned into a dove, and flew at the window, where, as he struck his head through the panes, he cut himself sorely. Grannonia, who thus saw herself at the same moment happy and unhappy, joyful and miserable, rich and poor, tore her hair and bewailed her fate, reproaching her father and mother. But they excused themselves, declaring that they had not meant to do harm. But she went on weeping and wailing until night came forth to drape the canopy of the sky for the funeral of the sun. And when they were all in bed, she took her jewels, which were in a writing desk, and went out by the back door to search everywhere for the treasure she had lost. She went out of the city, guided by the light of the moon, and on her way she met a fox, who asked her if she wished for company. "Of all things, my friend," replied Grannonia, "I should be delighted, for I am not over well acquainted with the country." So they travelled along together till they came to a wood, where the trees, at play like children, were making baby houses for the shadows to lie in. And as they were now tired and wished to rest, they sheltered under the leaves, where a fountain was playing tricks with the grass, throwing water on it by the dishful. There they stretched themselves on a mattress of tender soft grass, and paid the duty of repose which they owed to nature for the merchandise of life. They did not awake till the sun, with his usual fire, gave the signal to sailors and travellers to set out on their road. And after they awoke, they still stayed for some time, listening to the songs of the birds, in which Grannonia took great delight. The fox, seeing this, said to her, "You would feel twice as much pleasure if, like me, you understood what they are saying." At these words, Grannonia, for women are by nature as curious as they are talkative, begged the fox to tell her what he had heard the birds saying. So, after having let her entreat him for a long time, to raise her curiosity about what he was going to relate, he told her that the birds were talking to each other about what had lately befallen the king's son, who was as beautiful as a jay. Because he had offended a wicked ogress, she had laid him under a spell to pass 7 years in the form of a serpent, and when he had nearly ended the 7 years, he fell in love with the daughter of a king, and being one day in a room with the maiden, he had cast his skin on the ground, when her father and mother rushed in and burned it. Then, when the prince was flying away in the shape of a dove, he broke a pane in the window to escape, and hurt his head so severely that he was given over by the doctors. Grannonia, who thus heard her own onions spoken of, asked if there was any cure for this injury. The fox replied that there was none other than by anointing his wounds with the blood of those very birds that had been telling the story. When Grannonia heard this, she fell down on her knees to the fox, entreating him to catch those birds for her, that she might get their blood, adding that, like honest comrades, they would share the gain. "Fair and softly," said the fox, "let us wait till night, and when the birds are gone to bed, trust me to climb the tree and capture them, one after the other." So they waited till day was gone, and Earth had spread out her great black board to catch the wax that might drop from the tapers of night. Then the fox, as soon as he saw all the birds fast asleep on the branches, stole up quite softly, and one after another throttled all the linnets, larks, tomtits, blackbirds, woodpeckers, thrushes, jays, flycatchers, little owls, goldfinches, bullfinches, chaffinches, and redbreasts that were on the trees. And when he had killed them all, they put the blood in a little bottle, which the fox carried with him to refresh himself on the road.
I'll pause the story here to note that it gives quite detailed instructions on what's required to make this potion. The fox seems to want it as a traveller's restorative. How he, or originally she, handles the bottle, or originally flask, is unclear. Is he a fairy or a shapeshifter? That being said, might a witch with an experimental bent try the potion and see what it cures? Presumably it works on normal humans, but even if it only works on fairies, it might have value. Let's consider these birds for a moment. The list given previously was changed from the Italian to English birds. One that turns up in both lists are goldfinches. These are a little songbird that has a red patch on the top of its head. Folkloristically, it's linked to the redcap goblins, who provide the fairy blood in one of the lineages of House Macare. It's thought to cure illnesses with its song, and to omen wealth because of its gold feathers. A group of goldfinches is called a charm. This is obviously interesting to magi. Linguistically, it comes from the word chime, because a group of goldfinches sound a little like a carillon of bells. Back over to Joy Chan.
Granonia was so overjoyed that she hardly touched the ground. But the fox said to her, "What fine joy in a dream is this, my daughter? You have done nothing, unless you mix my blood also with that of the birds." And so saying, he set off to run away. Granonia, who saw all her hopes likely to be destroyed, had recourse to woman's art, flattery. And she said to him, "Gossip fox, there would be some reason for your saving your hide if I were not under so many obligations to you, and if there were no other foxes in the world. But you know how much I owe you, and that there is no scarcity of the likes of you on these plains. Rely on my good faith. Don't act like the cow that kicks over the pail which she has just filled with milk. You have done the chief part, and now you fail at the last. Do stop, believe me, and come with me to the city of this king, where you may sell me for a slave if you will." The fox never dreamed that he could be outforced by a woman, so he agreed to travel on with her. But they had hardly gone 50 paces when she lifted up the stick she carried and gave him such a neat rap that he forthwith stretched his legs. Then she put his blood into the little bottle, and setting off again she stayed not till she came to Big Valley, where she went straightway to the royal palace and sent word that she was come to cure the prince. Then the king ordered her to be brought before him, and he was astonished at seeing a girl undertake a thing which the best doctors in his kingdom had failed to do. However, a trial could do no harm, and so he said he wished greatly to see the experiment made. But Granonia answered, "If I succeed, you must promise to give him to me for a husband." The king, who looked on his son to be even as already dead, answered her, "If you give him to me safe and sound, I will give him to you sound and safe, for it is no great matter to give a husband to her that gives me a son." So they went to the chamber of the prince, and hardly had she anointed him with the blood, when he found himself just as if nothing had ever ailed him. Granonia, when she saw the prince stout and hearty, bade the king keep his word. Whereupon he, turning to his son, said, "My son, a moment ago you were all but dead, and now I see you alive, and can hardly believe it. Therefore, as I have promised this maiden that if she cured you, she should have you for a husband, now enable me to perform my promise, by all the love you bear me, since gratitude obliges me to pay this debt." When the prince heard these words, he said, "Sir, I would that I was free to prove to you the love I bear you, but as I have already pledged my faith to another woman, you would not consent that I should break my word, nor would this maiden wish that I should do such a wrong to her whom I love, nor can I indeed alter my mind." Granonia, hearing this, felt a secret pleasure not to be described, at finding herself still alive in the memory of the prince. Her whole face became crimson as she said, "If I could induce this maiden to resign her claims, would you then consent to my wish?" "Never," replied the prince, "will I banish from this breast the fair image of her whom I love. I shall ever remain of the same mind and will, and I would sooner see myself in danger of losing my place at the table of life than play so mean a trick." Granonia could no longer disguise herself, and discovered to the prince who she was; for, the chamber having been darkened on account of the wound in his head, he had not known her. But the prince, now that he recognised her, embraced her with a joy that would amaze you, telling his father what he had done and suffered for her. Then they sent to invite her parents, the King and Queen of Longfield, and they celebrated the wedding with wonderful festivity, making great sport of the great ninny of a fox, and concluding at the last of the last that pain doth indeed a seasoning prove unto the joys of constant love.
The next story, The She-Bear, again is similar between the English and the newer English translation from the Neapolitan. I'll just mention that the framing narrative says that people found the previous story uproariously funny.
Stories from Pentamerone by Giambattista Basire. Chapter 15. The She-Bear. Recording by Joy Chan. Truly the wise man said well, that a command of gall cannot be obeyed like one of sugar. A man must require just and reasonable things if he would see the scales of obedience properly trimmed. From orders which are improper springs resistance which is not easily overcome, as happened to the King of Rough Rock, who, by asking what he ought not of his daughter, caused her to run away from him at the risk of losing both honour and life. There lived, it is said, once upon a time, a King of Rough Rock, who had a wife, the very mother of beauty. But in the full career of her years she fell from the horse of health and broke her life. Before the candle of life went out at the auction of her years, she called her husband and said to him, I know you have always loved me tenderly. Show me, therefore, at the close of my days, the completion of your love by promising me never to marry again, unless you find a woman as beautiful as I have been. Otherwise I leave you my curse, and shall bear you hatred even in the other world.
The method of the curse is of interest to us as people who collect folk charms. The Queen threatens to squeeze the curse from her breasts. She says this in a rather more colloquial way. This has cultural elements in it which may have seen it removed from the story, not so much because of its risque nature as because it requires a level of cultural competency beyond what the period English reader was expected to have. But in the same way that the evil eye is caused by making a hand gesture or by staring at a person, similarly, curses among Neapolitans can be passed by pumping the breasts in a person's direction. I'm going to have to put an explicit tag on this episode, aren't I? Oh well.
The King, who loved his wife beyond measure, hearing this her last wish, burst into tears, and for some time could not answer a single word. At last, when he had done weeping, he said to her, Sooner than take another wife, may the gout lay hold of me. May I have my head cut off like a mackerel. My dearest love, drive such a thought from your mind. Do not believe in dreams, or that I could love any other woman. You were the first new coat of my love, and you shall carry away with you the last rags of my affection.
I think the bit about the mackerel is new. There is one word I can't make sense of in the newer Penguin translation. Maybe it means fish. He has another method of death, which is in the Penguin edition. It's, may I be driven through with a Catalan spear. Catalan spear is a spear used by the Spanish, who were not at the stage where the story is purportedly being written, invading Italy in the way that they later would. But references to Catalan heavy knights do turn up repeatedly in the story.
As he said these words, the poor young queen, who was at the point of death, turned up her eyes and stretched out her feet. When the King saw her life thus running out, he unstopped the channels of his eyes, and made such a howling and beating and outcry that all the court came running up, calling on the name of the dear soul, and upbraiding Fortune for taking her from him, and plucking out his beard, he cursed the stars that had sent him such a misfortune. But bearing in mind the maxim, pain in one's elbow and pain for one's wife are alike hard to bear, but are soon over. Ere the knight had gone forth into the place of arms in the sky to muster the bats, he began to count upon his fingers, and to reflect thus to himself: Here is my wife dead, and I am left a wretched widower, with no hope of seeing any one but this poor daughter whom she has left me. I must therefore try to discover some means or other of having a son and heir. But where shall I look? Where shall I find a woman equal in beauty to my wife? Every one appears a witch in comparison with her.
In the Penguin edition, it's a harpy.
Where then shall I find another with a bit of stick, or seek another with the bell, if nature made Nardella, may she be in glory, and then broke the mould? Alas, in what a labyrinth has she put me, in what a perplexity has the promise I made her left me! But what do I say? I am running away before I have seen the wolf. Let me open my eyes and ears and look about. May there not be some other as beautiful? Is it possible that the world should be lost to me? Is there such a dearth of women, or is the race extinct? So saying, he forthwith issued a proclamation and command that all the handsome women in the world should come to the touchstone of beauty, for he would take the most beautiful to wife, and endow her with a kingdom. Now, when this news was spread abroad, there was not a woman in the universe who did not come to try her luck, not a witch, however ugly, who stayed behind. For when it is a question of beauty, no scullion wench will acknowledge herself surpassed.
In the Penguin edition, it's not scullion wench, it's hag. Note the classism that is normal in English fairy tales at the translations period.
Every one piques herself on being the handsomest, and if the looking-glass tells her the truth, she blames the glass for being untrue, and the quicksilver for being put on badly. When the town was thus filled with women, the king had them all drawn up in a line, and he walked up and down from top to bottom, and as he examined and measured each from head to foot.
In the Penguin edition, he's measuring them like the Grand Turk entering his seraglio, seeking to sharpen his Damascus knife. This was considered subtle wit at the time.
One appeared to him wry-browed, another long-nosed, another broad-mouthed, another thick-lipped, another tall as a maypole.
In the Penguin edition, it's a beanpole, not a maypole. The history of maypoles is something we've managed to avoid in Ars Magica because they come far later than the period. However, now that I'm doing some work for Magonomia, I would still be forcing it back in ahistorically. Still, we should have a bit of a look at them.
Another short and dumpy, another too stout, another too slender. The Spaniard did not please him on account of her dark colour.
The Penguin edition uses sallow rather than dark. Sallow means an unhealthy yellow or brown colour. This is still a racist jibe. It's a different racist jibe based on the difference between the two translations' audiences.
The Neapolitan was not to his fancy on account of her gait.
In the Penguin edition, it's not her gait, it's because of the platform heels she walks in. These were used by people of great metropolises, like Naples, because the streets were too filthy to walk on. It raised you up out of the muck. Note that the audience are theoretically Neapolitans themselves, so some of them must similarly have these sorts of shoes. These sorts of shoes were originally donned by peasant men. Actually, I may be thinking of a Dutch variant, and there it was for when you were working in places like slaughterhouses, so that you wouldn't have to stand in the splatter.
The German appeared cold and icy, the Frenchwoman frivolous and giddy. The Venetian with her light hair looked like a distaff of flax.
Her hair is literally bleached in the Penguin edition, and we've covered in some detail over in the Venice episodes that a great deal of effort was taken to make the hair pale and fine among women of a certain class.
At the end of the end, one for this cause and another for that, he sent them all away, with one hand before and the other behind. And seeing that so many fair faces were all show and no wool, he turned his thoughts to his own daughter, saying, Why do I go seeking the impossible, when my daughter Preziosa is formed in the same mould of beauty as her mother? I have this fair face here in my house. and yet go looking for it at the fag end of the world. She shall marry whom I will, and so I shall have an heir."
The father uses a phrase which has been trimmed here because it needs a bit of historical depth to understand, but it appears in the Penguin edition as, "Why am I looking for Maria per Ravenna?" This refers to something that you know you cannot find. It's theoretically a reference to a 15th century erotic poem, but I can't find the poem. Its trail is obscured by a 19th century erotic novel based on the poem, and my lack of skill in Italian. The fag end, in this case, is the arsehole, in the Penguin, of the world. Oddly, this isn't a coded homophobic slur, because the use of that word appears continents and decades away from the work that I'm quoting here.
When Preziosa heard this, she retired to her chamber, and bewailing her ill fortune, as if she would not leave a hair upon her head. And whilst she was lamenting thus, an old woman came to her who was her confidant.
In the Penguin edition, she's not this meek. She rounds on her father and insults him so stridently that he threatens that he will kill her and beat her so that the largest remaining part of her will be her ear. Then she retires. This story is theoretically being told to female Neapolitan courtiers, and therefore the female leads are a lot more aggressive and self-determined and self-reliant than in the later translation, which is the one that Joy's reading, which is for Victorian English children.
As soon as she saw Preziosa, who seemed to belong more to the other world than to this, and heard the cause of her grief, the old woman said to her, "Cheer up, my daughter, do not despair. There is a remedy for every evil save death. Now listen. If your father speaks to you thus once again, put this bit of wood into your mouth, and instantly you will be changed into a she-bear."
The Penguin edition is much more direct. "If your father chooses to act the stallion tonight."
"Then off with you, for in his fright he will let you depart, and go straight to the wood, where heaven has kept good fortune in store for you since the day you were born, and whenever you wish to appear a woman, as you are and will remain, only take the piece of wood out from your mouth, and you will return to your true form." Then Preziosa embraced the old woman, and, giving her a good apronful of meal and ham and bacon, sent her away. As soon as the sun began to change his quarters,
In the Penguin edition, where they don't like sex workers, it says, "when the sun began to change his quarters like an unsuccessful whore." They say that about the sun a lot, and I'm not quite sure what cultural element is playing in there.
the king ordered the musicians to come, and, inviting all his lords and vassals, he held a great feast. And after dancing for 5 or 6 hours, they all sat down to table and ate and drank beyond measure.
In the Penguin edition, it's Moorish dancing, which is presumably a racist slur. I don't know enough about the dance customs of the Neapolitans to know. However, by the time this is translated for Victorian readers, it's removed, because if you said Moorish dancing, they would assume you meant what we now call Morris dancing. And so, for me, the whole thing is far more amusing if people are going around with bells tied to their knees and are gently bonking each other on the head with sticks.
Then the king asked his courtiers to whom he should marry Preziosa, as she was the picture of his dead wife. But the instant Preziosa heard this, she slipped the bit of wood into her mouth, and took the figure of a terrible she-bear, at the sight of which all present were frightened out of their wits, and ran off as fast as they could scamper.
In the Penguin edition, there are fewer courtiers, and the scene is taking place in a bedroom, so it's harder for them to flee. I'm not saying that if I suddenly had the form of a bear, I would have, in her place, torn them all limb from limb, leaving no part larger than an ear, because I have a sense of irony, but the thought would certainly cross my mind.
Meanwhile Preziosa went out, and took her way to a wood, where the shades were holding consultation how they might do some mischief to the sun at the close of day. And there she stayed, in the pleasant companionship of the other animals, until the son of the King of Running Water came to hunt in that part of the country, who, at the sight of the bear, had like to have died on the spot. But when he saw the beast come gently up to him, wagging her tail like a little dog, and rubbing her sides against him, he took courage and patted her and said, good bear, there, there, poor beast, poor beast."
In the Penguin edition, he makes calming animal noises to her. He impersonates a cat and a dog. Why he thinks impersonating either a cat or a dog should allow him to speak to a bear, I'm not absolutely certain, although in Realms of Power Magic, I do recall that all quadrupeds share some sort of mystical language, so maybe he knows things that I don't about talking to passing bears.
Then he led her home, and ordered that she should be taken great care of, and he had her put into a garden close to the royal palace, that he might see her from the window whenever he wished. One day, when all the people of the house were gone out and the prince was left alone, he went to the window to look out at the bear. And there he beheld Preziosa, who had taken the piece of wood out of her mouth, combing her golden tresses. At the sight of this beauty, which was beyond the beyonds, he had like to have lost his senses with amazement, and tumbling down the stairs he ran out into the garden. But Preziosa, who was on the watch and observed him, popped the piece of wood into her mouth, and was instantly changed into a bear again. When the prince came down and looked about in vain for Preziosa, whom he had seen from the window above, he was so amazed at the trick that a deep melancholy came over him, and in 4 days he fell sick, crying continually, "My bear, my bear!" His mother, hearing him wailing thus, imagined that the bear had done him some hurt, and gave orders that she should be killed. But the servants, enamoured of the tameness of the bear, who made herself beloved by the very stones in the road, took pity on her, and, instead of killing her, they led her to the wood, and told the queen that they had put an end to her. When this came to the ears of the prince, he acted in a way to pass belief. Ill or well, he jumped out of bed, and was going at once to make mincemeat of the servants. But when they told him the truth of the affair, he jumped on horseback, half dead as he was, and went rambling about and seeking everywhere, until at length he found the bear. Then he took her home again, and putting her into a chamber said to her, "O lovely morsel for a king, who art shut up in this skin! O candle of love, who art enclosed within this hairy lanthorn! Wherefore all this trifling? Do you wish to see me pine and pant and die by inches? I am wasting away, without hope, and tormented by thy beauty. And you see clearly the proof, for I am shrunk 2/3 in size, like wine boiled down, and am nothing but skin and bone, for the fever is double-stitched to my veins. So lift up the curtain of this hairy hide, and let me gaze upon the spectacle of thy beauty. Raise, oh raise the leaves of this basket, and let me get a sight of the fine fruit beneath. Lift up that curtain, and let my eyes pass in to behold the pomp of wonders. Who has shut up so smooth a creature in a prison woven of hair? Who has locked up so rich a treasure in a leathern chest? Let me behold this display of graces, and take in payment all my love, for nothing else can cure the troubles I endure." But when he had said again and again, this and a great deal more, and still saw that all his words were thrown away, he took to his bed, and had such a desperate fit that the doctors prognosticated badly of his case. Then his mother, who had no other joy in the world, sat down by his bedside and said to him, "My son, whence comes all this grief? What melancholy humour has seized you? You are young, you are loved, you are great, you are rich. What then is it you want, my son? Speak, a bashful beggar carries an empty bag. If you want a wife, only choose, and I will bring the match about."
In the Penguin edition, she says, rather, "I will put down a deposit." By this, she's referring to a dowry. Italian dowries are interestingly different from English dowries, and we covered them in a very early episode, Games from Folktales 26. The examples I used there were from Shakespeare, but those people were pretending to be Italians.
Do you take, and I'll pay? Do you not see that your illness is an illness to me? Your pulse beats with fever in your veins, and my heart beats with illness in my brain, for I have no other support of my old age than you. So be cheerful now, and cheer up my heart, and do not see the whole kingdom thrown into mourning, and this house into lamentation, and your mother forlorn and heartbroken.
In the Penguin edition, the mother offers to shave off her hair. I'm not sure of the cultural connotation here, but I believe it's a mourning ritual.
When the prince heard these words, he said, "Nothing can console me but the sight of the bear. Therefore, if you wish to see me well again, let her be brought into this chamber. I will have no one else to attend me, and make my bed and cook for me, but she herself. And you may be sure that this pleasure will make me well in a trice." Thereupon his mother, although she thought it ridiculous enough for the bear to act as cook and chambermaid, and feared that her son was not in his right mind, yet, in order to gratify him, had the bear fetched. And when the bear came up to the prince's bed, she raised her paw and felt the patient's pulse, which made the queen laugh outright, for she thought every moment that the bear would scratch his nose. Then the prince said, "My dear bear, will you not cook for me and give me my food and wait upon me?" And the bear nodded her head to show that she accepted the office. Then his mother had some fowls brought, and a fire lighted on the hearth in the same chamber, and some water set to boil. Whereupon the bear, laying hold of a fowl, scalded and plucked it handily, and drew it, and then stuck one portion of it on the spit, and with the other part she made such a delicious hash that the prince, who could not relish even sugar, licked his fingers at the taste.
So, hash here is a 19th century English translation of gratin. A gratin, or gratin, as we call them in Australian, are a sort of casserole that has a browned upper crust, usually made out of breadcrumbs and cheese. I'm not sure how you would make one in a fireplace. I could do it with a camp oven by putting coals on the lid.
And when he had done eating, the bear handed him drink with such grace that the queen was ready to kiss her on the forehead. Thereupon the prince arose, and the bear quickly set about making the bed, and running into the garden, she gathered a cloth full of roses and citron flowers, and strewed them over it, so that the queen said the bear was worth her weight in gold, and that her son had good reason to be fond of her.
Citron flowers here are a translator's mistake, but an informative one. In English, the term citron originally covered what we now call a citron, but also what the French call a citron, the lemon, and perhaps other citrus fruit. It's not much of a stretch to suggest that the fruit here meant is an orange, and that these are orange blossoms, as translated in the Penguin edition, because it's known for its strongly scented, somewhat aphrodisiacal flowers. Note, aphrodisiacal in folklore. I'm not talking from personal experience. For my fellow Australians, I'm not talking about the Buddha's hand citron, which is the one I see locally the most often, or the yuzu, which is the citron that I eat most often. The citron being discussed here is a sort of knobbly football shape, a little bit like a large orange eureka lemon.
But when the prince saw these pretty offices, they only added fuel to the fire. And if before he wasted by ounces, he now melted away by pounds. And he said to the queen, "My lady mother, if I do not give this bear a kiss, the breath will leave my body." Whereupon the queen, seeing him fainting away, said, kiss him, my beautiful beast! Let me not see my poor son die of longing." Then the bear went up to the prince, and taking him by the cheeks, kissed him again and again. Meanwhile, I know not how it was, the piece of wood slipped out of Preziosa's mouth, and she remained in the arms of the prince, the most beautiful creature in the world. And pressing her to his heart, he said, "I have caught you, my little rogue. You shall not escape from me again without a good reason." At these words, Preziosa, adding the colour of modesty to the picture of her natural beauty, said to him, I am indeed in your hands. Only guard me safely, and marry me when you will." Then the queen inquired who the beautiful maiden was, and what had brought her to this savage life. And Preziosa related the whole story of her misfortunes, at which the queen, praising her as a good and virtuous girl, told her son that she was content that Preziosa should be his wife. Then the prince, who desired nothing else in life, forthwith pledged her his faith, and the mother giving them her blessing, this happy marriage was celebrated with great feasting and illuminations, and Preziosa experienced the truth of the saying that one who acts well may always expect good.
Let us pause to consider what a light display is here. The temptation is to think they're fireworks. I was looking into the history of fireworks for a Magonomia spell the other day, and found out that in the Elizabethan period they were known in Arabic as Chinese flowers, which is lovely, and they were used, but they were not as bright or as colourful as now. It turns out that one of the things that gives the distinctive silver shine to modern fireworks is powdered aluminium. That wasn't known to exist in period. Similarly, most of the colours that we now have are due to adulterants in the gunpowder that have yet to be discovered in Europe. I know Napoleonic navies had some sort of signalling flares, but I've not followed up their history. And now, our third story.
Stories from Pentamerone by Giambattista Basire. Chapter 16. The Dove. Recording by Joy Chan. He who is born a prince should not act like a beggar boy.
In the Penguin edition, it's scoundrel rather than beggar boy. Again, the difference is because the Victorian writer hates poor people rather more than the Italian writer who just ignores poor people.
The man who is high in rank ought not to set a bad example to those below him, for the little donkey learns from the big one to eat straw. It is no wonder, therefore, that heaven sends him troubles by bushels, as happened to a prince who was brought into great difficulties for ill-treating and tormenting a poor woman, so that he was near losing his life miserably.
In the Penguin edition, it says, the prince is acting like he has a gadfly up his arse. This is the first time I have seen such an early reference to the idea of having a bug in your butt, causing you to act in a aggressive or agitated fashion.
About 8 miles from Naples there was once a deep wood of fig trees and poplars. In this wood stood a half-ruined cottage wherein dwelt an old woman who was as light of teeth as she was burdened with years. She had 100 wrinkles in her face and a great many more in her purse, and all her silver covered her head, so that she went from one thatched cottage to another, begging alms to keep life in her. But as folks nowadays much rather give a purse full of crowns to a crafty spy than a farthing to a poor needy man, she had to toil a whole day to get a dish of kidney beans, and that at a time when they were very plentiful. Now one day the poor old woman, after having washed the beans, put them in a pot, placed it outside the window, and went on her way to the wood to gather sticks for the fire. But while she was away, Nardo Aniello, the king's son, passed by the cottage on his way to the chase, and seeing the pot at the window, he took a great fancy to have a fling at it, and he made a bet with his attendants to see who should fling the straightest and hit in the middle with a stone. Then they began to throw at the innocent pot, and in 3 or 4 casts the prince hit it to a hair and won the bet. The old woman returned just after they had gone away, and seeing the sad disaster, she began to act as if she were beside herself, crying, "Ay, let him stretch out his arm and go about boasting how he has broken this pot, the villainous rascal who has sown my beans out of season. If he had no compassion for my misery, he should have had some regard for his own interest. For I pray heaven, on my bare knees and from the bottom of my soul, that he may fall in love with the daughter of some ogress who may plague and torment him in every way. May his mother-in-law lay on him such a curse that he may see himself living and yet bewail himself as dead. and being spellbound by the beauty of the daughter and the arts of the mother, may he never be able to escape, but be obliged to remain. May she order him about with a cudgel in her hand, and give him bread with a little fork, that he may have good cause to lament over my beans which he has spilt on the ground.
In the Penguin edition, the curses are quite similar, but they differ in one key respect, which is that she mentions the coat of arms of the princeling who has smashed her pot, which means that in her case, the curse is targeted, not merely general.
The old woman's curses took wing, and flew up to heaven in a trice, so that, notwithstanding what a proverb says, for a woman's curse you are never the worse, and the coat of a horse that has been cursed always shines, she rated the prince so soundly that he well nigh jumped out of his skin.
The Penguin edition translates this as, "You may sow a woman's curse in your asshole." I remind you that this was written for children, and again, I beg your indulgence and suggest that it is similar in tone to the work of Dav Pilkey and the Captain Underpants stories.
Scarcely had 2 hours passed, when the prince, losing himself in the wood and parted from his attendants, met a beautiful maiden, who was going along picking up snails and saying with a laugh, "Snail, snail, put out your horn, your mother is laughing you to scorn, for she has a little son just born." When the prince saw this beautiful apparition, he knew not what had befallen him, and as the beams from the eyes of that crystal face fell upon the tinder of his heart, he was all in a flame, so that he became a lime kiln, wherein the stones of designs were burnt to build the houses of hopes. Now Philodoro, for so the maiden was named, was no wiser than other people, and the prince, being a smart young fellow with handsome mustachios, pierced her heart through and through, so that they stood looking at one another for compassion with their eyes, which proclaimed aloud the secret of their souls.
The mustachios do not come into it at all in the Penguin edition. It does say she does not waste her time peeling medlars, but falls for him right away. Let's unpack that phrase. Medlars are a fruit that was popular in the Middle Ages, but have fallen out of modern favour. They fruit in the winter, which was welcome, but they can only be eaten once they have bletted. That is, they can't be eaten until they start to decay due to frost damage. This is much like quinces, mentioned in the episode about the Goblin Market. They also have these freaky little tentacles on them and are brown, which doesn't help their shelf appeal. That they are not ripe before they rot was used for various metaphors in the Elizabethan period, particularly regarding sex work. Peeling medlars is a waste of time because, by the time you can eat them, the skins are soft enough that they too are edible.
After they had both remained thus for a long time, unable to utter a single word, the prince at last, finding his voice, addressed Philodoro thus: "From what meadow has this flower of beauty sprung? From what mine has this treasure of beauteous things come to light? O happy woods, O fortunate groves, which this nobility inhabits, which this illumination of the festivals of love irradiates?" "Kiss this hand, my lord," answered Philodoro. "Not so much modesty, for all the praise that you have bestowed on me belongs to your virtues, not to my merits. Such as I am, handsome or ugly, fat or thin, a witch or a fairy, I am wholly at your command, for your manly form has captivated my heart, your princely mien has pierced me through from side to side, and from this moment I give myself up to you, for ever as a changed slave." At these words the prince seized at once her hand, kissing the ivory hook that had caught his heart. At this ceremony of the prince, Philodoro's face grew as red as scarlet.
The ivory hook that had caught his heart is one of the metaphors used in the Penguin edition. The others are the bell of the dinner of delight and a call to horse for amorous battle. When it mentions her face as being scarlet, there's a lot more in the Penguin edition, and because we're looking at the alchemy of makeup over in the Venice episodes, I'd like to tarry here a bit. Her face is a blend of the minim of embarrassment, the cerise of fear, the verdigris of hope, and the cinnabar of desire. Minim is red lead. used for the rubrication of capital letters in books. It comes from Iberia. Cerise is cherry pink. Verdigris is green, usually copper carbonate. And cinnabar is a red oxide of mercury. The main producer in period is a single mine in Spain. Cinnabar and minim are used in the modern day as synonyms, and there was some confusion in period between the two.
But the more Nardo Aniello wished to continue speaking, the more his tongue seemed tied. For in this wretched life there is no wine of enjoyment without dregs of vexation. And just at this moment Philodoro's mother suddenly appeared, who was such an ugly ogress that nature seemed to have formed her as a model of horrors. Her hair was like a besom of holly, her forehead like a rough stone. Her eyes were comets that predicted all sorts of evils. Her mouth had tusks like a boar's. In short, from head to foot she was ugly beyond imagination. Now she seized Nardo Aniello by the nape of his neck, saying, "Hullo, what now, you thief, you rogue?"
Notes from the Penguin edition. The rough stone is Genoese stone. I've not been able to trace that reference. It's to sharpen the knife of fear that rips open chests. She also causes, quote, diarrhea of the soul, and her mouth is as big as a scorpion fish's. It also notes that if he did not die of shock, it must be because he has a story of Marco and Fleurella in his jacket. That's a reference to a popular but now lost work by William of Blois. We know Flower at Marcus was a tragedy, but we know virtually nothing else about it.
"Yourself the rogue," replied the prince. "Back with you, old hag!" And he was just going to draw his sword, when all at once he stood fixed like a sheep that has seen the wolf, and can neither stir nor utter a sound, so that the ogress led him like an ass by the halter to her house. And when they came there, she said to him, "Mind now, and work like a dog, unless you wish to die like a dog. For your first task to-day, you must have this acre of land dug and sown, level as this room, and recollect that if I return in the evening and do not find the work finished, I shall eat you up." Then, bidding her daughter take care of the house, she went to a meeting of the other ogresses in the wood. Nardo Aniello, seeing himself in this dilemma, began to bathe his breast with tears, cursing his fate which brought him to this pass. But Philodoro comforted him, bidding him be of good heart, for she would ever risk her life to assist him. She said that she ought not to lament his fate which had led him to the house where she lived, who loved him so dearly, and that he showed little return for her love by being so despairing at what had happened. The prince replied, "I am not grieved at having exchanged the royal palace for this hovel, splendid banquets for a crust of bread, a sceptre for a spade, not at seeing myself, who have terrified armies, now frightened by this hideous scarecrow. For I should deem all my disasters good fortune to be with you and to gaze upon you with these eyes. But what pains me to the heart is that I have to dig till my hands are covered with hard skin. I, whose fingers are so delicate and soft as Barbary wool, and, what is still worse, I have to do more than 2 oxen could get through in a day. If I do not finish the task this evening, your mother will eat me up. Yet I should not grieve so much to quit this wretched body as to be parted from so beautiful a creature." So saying, he heaved sighs by bushels and shed many tears. But Philodoro, drying his eyes, said to him, "Fear not that my mother will touch a hair of your head. Trust to me, and do not be afraid, for you must know that I possess magical powers, and am able to make cream set on water and to darken the sun. Be of good heart, for by the evening the piece of land will be dug and sown without anyone stirring a hand."
Making cheese out of water, that is curdling water in the Penguin edition. Curdling milk in period was a sign of evil. It was something that happened when witches passed by the farm. Curdling water would be a sign of legendary vileness. So it seems to have changed to her being able to make magical cheese. That's a handy talent, very Tiffany aching.
When Nardo Aniello heard this, he answered, "If you have magic power, as you say, O beauty of the world, why do we not fly from this country? For you shall live like a queen in my father's house." And Philodora replied, "A certain conjunction of the stars prevents this, but the trouble will soon pass, and we shall be happy."
Maginomia players, that's a general divination astrology. Us Magica players, she's a fairy. She needs him to suffer for a bit longer.
With these and 1,000 other pleasant discourses, the day passed, and when the ogress came back, she called to her daughter from the road and said, "Philodoro, let down your hair." For as the house had no staircase, she always ascended by her daughter's tresses. As soon as Philodoro heard her mother's voice, she unbound her hair and let fall her tresses, making a golden ladder to an iron heart. Whereupon the old woman mounted up quickly and ran into the garden, but when she found it all dug and sown, she was beside herself with amazement, for it seemed to her impossible that a delicate lad should have accomplished such hard labour. But the next morning, hardly had the sun gone out to warm himself on account of the cold he had caught in the river of India, than the ogress went down again, bidding Nardo Aniello take care that in the evening she should find ready split 6 stacks of wood which were in the cellar, with every log cleft into 4 pieces, or otherwise she would cut him up like bacon, and make a fry of him for supper. On hearing this decree, the poor prince had like to have died of terror, and Philodoro, seeing him half dead and pale as ashes, said, "Why, what a coward you are to be frightened at such a trifle!"
In the Penguin edition, she doesn't call him a coward, she calls him a pants-shitter. As a reminder, these stories are written for wealthy women and courtiers, and the woman who is saying this to the prince is deeply in love with him, and therefore this seems to be part of the general cut and thrust of romantic life in this part of medieval Italy.
"Do you think it a trifle," replied Nardo Aniello, "to split 6 stacks of wood, with every log cleft into 4 pieces, between this time and the evening? Alas, I shall sooner be cleft in halves myself, to fill the mouth of this horrid old woman." "Fear not," answered Philodoro, "for without giving yourself any trouble, the wood shall all be split in good time. But meanwhile cheer up, if you love me, and do not split my heart with such lamentations." Now when the sun had shut up the shop of his rays, in order not to sell light to the shades, the old woman returned, and, bidding Philodoro let down the usual ladder, she ascended, and finding the wood already split, she began to suspect it was her own daughter who had given her this check. At the 3rd day, in order to make a 3rd trial, she told the prince to clean out for her a cistern which held 1,000 casks of water, for she wished to fill it anew, adding that if the task were not finished by the evening, she would make mincemeat of him. When the old woman went away, Nardo Aniello began again to weep and wail, and Philodoro, seeing that the labours increased, and that the old woman had something of the brute in her to burden the poor fellow with such tasks and troubles, said to him, "Be quiet, and as soon as the moment has passed that interrupts my art, before the sun says I am off, we will say good-bye to this house. Sure enough, this evening my mother shall find the land cleared, and I will go off with you, alive or dead." The prince, on hearing this news, embraced Philodoro and said, "Thou art the pole star of this storm-tossed bark, my soul. Thou art the prop of my hopes."
A bark here is a ship. In the Penguin edition, it's "You are the north wind of the ship of my soul." We sometimes spell it Barquue here in Australia. It's an archaic spelling. But when Captain Cook rocked up, he was in a bark, and we don't like it to sound like he was in a canoe.
Now when the evening drew nigh, Philodora having dug a hole in the garden into a large underground passage, they went out and took the way to Naples. But when they arrived at the grotto of Pozzuolo, Nardo Aniello said to Philodoro, "It will never do for me to take you to the palace on foot and dressed in this manner. Therefore wait at this inn, and I will soon return with horses, carriages, servants, and clothes." So Philodoro stayed behind, and the prince went on his way to the city. Meantime the ogress returned home, and as Philodoro did not answer to her usual summons, she grew suspicious, ran into the wood, and cutting a great long pole, placed it against the window, and climbed up like a cat. Then she went into the house, and hunted everywhere inside and out, high and low, but found no one. At last she perceived the hole, and seeing that it led into the open air, in her rage she did not leave a hair upon her head, cursing her daughter and the prince, and praying that at the first kiss Philodoro's lover should receive, he might forget her. But let us leave the old woman to say her wicked curses, and return to the prince, who on arriving at the palace, where he was thought to be dead, put the whole house in an uproar, every one running to meet him, and crying, "Welcome, welcome! Here he is, safe and sound! How happy we are to see him back in this country!" with 1,000 other words of affection. But as he was going up the stairs, his mother met him halfway, and embraced and kissed him, saying, "My son, my jewel, the apple of my eye, where have you been, and why have you stayed away so long to make us all die with anxiety?" The prince knew not what to answer, for he did not wish to tell her of his misfortunes. But no sooner had his mother kissed him than, owing to the curse, all that had passed went from his memory. Then the queen told her son that to put an end to his going hunting and wasting his time in the woods, she wished him to get married. "Well and good," replied the prince. "I am ready and prepared to do what you desire." So it was settled that within 4 days they should lead home to him the bride who had just arrived from the country of Flanders, and thereupon a great feasting and banquets were held.
Powerful perdo-mentum effect.
But meanwhile Philodoro, seeing that her husband stayed away so long, and hearing, I know not how, of the feast, waited in the evening till the servant lad of the inn had gone to bed, and taking his clothes from the head of the bed, she left her own in their place, and disguising herself like a man, went to the court of the king, where the cooks, being in want of help, took her as kitchen boy. When the tables were set out, and the guests all took their seats, and the dishes were set down, and the carver was cutting up a large English pie, which Philodoro had made with her own hands, lo, out flew such a beautiful dove, that the guests in their astonishment, forgetting to eat, fell to admiring the pretty bird, which said to the prince in a piteous voice,
So long-time listeners will know that I'm a fool for the history of pies. Did I ever write up the episode about my idea that a pie is a perfect sort of vessel for a potion? English pies in period have a hard outer shell called a coffin, which just means something like box or container in period. The pie crust is generally not eaten. Its function is to exclude air from the contents so they don't spoil. Pies are raised on wooden moulds called dollies and baked so they are waterproof before succulent morsels are put inside, and then a lid is put on. Generally something will go over the top of the pie filling to exclude air that would otherwise get in under the lid. Aspic, which is a sort of savoury gelatin, works best. As the sides of the pie are self-supporting, you can put other things inside. Songbirds are common, but I did read of one pie that had a diminutive jester inside it, who emerged much like a lady from a cake. The empty space inside pies can also be used to store clockworks, which can animate little figurines upon the top of the pie. One might put a bomb in a pie, but the lack of accurate and discreet fuses makes this much more difficult than a simple poison.
Have you so soon forgotten the love of Philodoro, and have all the services you received from her, ungrateful man, gone from your memory? Is it thus you repay the benefits she has done you, she who took you out of the claws of the ogress and gave you life, and herself too? Woe to the woman who trusts too much to the words of man, who ever requites kindness with ingratitude, and pays debts with forgetfulness. But go, forget your promises, false man, and may the curses follow you which the unhappy maiden sends you from the bottom of her heart. But if the gods have not locked up their ears, they will witness the wrong you have done her, and when you least expect it, the lightning and thunder, fever and illness will come to you. Enough, eat and drink, take your sports, for unhappy Philodoro, deceived and forsaken, will leave you the field open to make merry with your new wife.
In the Penguin edition, one of the things she asks during this stream of invectives is, "Have you eaten a cat's brain?" This was apparently a folk charm that provoked amnesia.
So saying, the dove flew away quickly and vanished like the wind. The prince, hearing the murmuring of the dove, stood for a while stupefied. At length he inquired whence the pie came, and when the carver told him that a scullion boy who had been taken to assist in the kitchen had made it, he ordered him to be brought into the room. Then Philodoro, throwing herself at the feet of Nardo Aniello, shedding a torrent of tears, said merely, "What have I done to you?" Whereupon the prince at once recalled to mind the engagement he had made with her, and, instantly raising her up, seated her by his side, and when he related to his mother the great obligation he was under to this beautiful maiden, and all that she had done for him, and how it was necessary that the promise he had given should be fulfilled, his mother, who had no other joy in life than her son, said to him, "Do as you please, so that you offend not this lady whom I have given you to wife." "Be not troubled," said the lady, "for to tell the truth, I am very loath to remain in this country. With your kind permission, I wish to return to my dear Flanders." Thereupon the prince with great joy offered her a vessel and attendants, and, ordering Philodoro to be dressed like a princess, when the tables were removed, the musicians came and they began the ball which lasted until evening.
In the Penguin edition there's an extra scene. A terrible mask appears and tells the prince that it is the ghost of the woman whose beans he spilled. She then explains her curse, then the ogress's curse on the kiss, and then she curses him again with the traditional saying, "He that spills beans grows horns," and vanishes. The fairy bride says not to worry about the curse, and that she'll get him out of it. Horns here could refer to going to hell, but it may also refer to cuckoldry. And if that's the case, her assurances aren't really worth much.
So the feast being now ended, they all betook themselves to rest, and the prince and Philodoro lived happily ever after, proving the truth of the proverb that he who stumbles and does not fall is helped on his way like a rolling ball.
So thank you, listener, for this strange episode, more explicit and somewhat longer than is usual. If you prefer this sort of thing, make sure to mention it on the various social media forums where Games from Folktales is active. Your saga may, and probably should, vary.